we go. I think. Okay, there we go. Okay, I might have to take so. Okay, it's Alexander Lawrence, the Portable Infinite here, New Noise radio show. Anyway, we're with Ian F. Svenonius. He's the author of the underground bestsellers, Supernatural Strategies for the Making of Rock and Roll Group, Making of a Rock and Roll Group, The Psychic Soviet, which I have right here, and Censorship Now.
Censorship Now, yeah.
And then this new book is Against the Written Word, which I have here,
Yeah,
which I just read this week. And he was the host of Soft Focus, so he interviewed a lot of the same people. I was, because I lived in Brooklyn, I was buddies with Genesis P. Orridge because he lived on the same subway line.
And, nice. Which one is that, James E?
No, the L. He lived over in Bush. He lived in Bushwick before anybody else did. And, when it was Bushwick was still kind of dangerous. I was kind of like, when I lived in Williamsburg in the 90s, there was, the Walkmen used to rehearse and the Interpol, and a lot of the guys used to live in Williamsburg, or they would practice there.
Yeah.
In that neighborhood. Okay, so anyway, if you're on the internet or anything.
Yeah, I remember the Walkman had a big studio. I actually.
Yeah, that was up in Harlem, but I guess it was Jonathan Fire Eater used to practice in Williamsburg before they moved.
Oh yeah.
So you have all these bands: Escapism, Chain and the Gang, The Makeup, Nation of Ulysses. You live in LA. How long have you lived in LA?
Just 5 years or something.
Okay, so you everybody.
Barely.
It just seems like everybody ends up in LA, at some point,
Well, it seems sort of like the last rock and roll scene in the USA. It's kind of the last. I mean, the risk of sounding, contentious or something. It's still a place where there's a lot of bands and people are interested in bands, and they're and it seems like bands don't have to just be, kind of hype, publicity creation. There's a lot of that here, but there's also sort of a little bit more of a grassrootsy underground thing that kind of resembles a rock and roll scene from the bygone era that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a lot better than, I'm from LA, and I left LA for San Francisco and New York in the 80s and 90s, and I kind of like the last 20 years I've been back. I kind of like LA again because it just seems real maverick. If you want to start something, LA is not really about anything. It's not like one thing's taken over. It's like how New York, there used to be 20 things going on at the same time, and it didn't, and then you kind of go to all these groups of people, and then you get back to your original group, and you're going, wow, man, it's I guess I got to move from New York because I've been everywhere,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask you, aren't you from the same area as Nick Zed? Maryland?
Yeah, we're from the same town actually. Nick Zed and I are both from Mount Rainier, Hyattsville. He went to High Point High School, I think. I went to Northwestern. He's older than me, but he.
Okay. So he lied about his age then. I thought you guys were the same age.
Oh no, I don't think so, but maybe. I have no idea. I mean, I definitely didn't know him.
Yeah.
And I think he was, he was also, he moved to New York, I think, really early.
Yeah, real early. So you didn't really bump into him. You were still.
But we went to, we're from the same town as John Fahey and Jim Henson.
Yeah, because when I first moved to New York in I moved there in 91, but when I came back in 96, I was I think New York Girls, and a lot of those, the Whitney was doing transgressive film kind of retrospective, and so I was, and I interviewed Nick Zed in 97, so and Richard Kern, so I knew those guys. I used to hang around them a bit, and I remember he was from Maryland and stuff, and I was reading.
He came to one of my shows and gave me a tape of his band. That was later, Zyklon B. When I was in the Makeup, he came and
I think your band and Nick Zed and Jack Sargent liked them. I remember back in the 90s, it was one of the only bands they even dared to mention. They were kind of pretty negative about most stuff.
Yeah, that's flattering. Yeah, he was cool. I am a big fan. I love his book. Totem of the Depraved. It's one of my
Yeah.
favorite books ever written. I think it's an incredible book. I tried to convince my publisher to put it out again because it went out of print. It was on Rollins's label, 213,
Yeah.
and it went out of print. And on Instagram, Nick Zed was like looking for a publisher, and I talked to, I mentioned it to my publisher, and he was just too swamped to deal with it.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to deal with. But yeah, I mean, yeah, when I think of the Akashic books, I think of Arthur Nersessian, The Fuck Up, and Johnny Temple. And I was working for Cups Magazine, and we had an office over on Houston and First Avenue. And Arthur Nersessian used to live there. I used to see Johnny Temple. I don't know if he lived in the Lower East Side or not, but I used to see him around all the time. Like,
Yeah, Johnny, I mean, he's the salt of the earth. I'm the first band I ever went out of town with on a tour capacity was his band. When I was 18, I, drove across the country with his band. I mean, I had obviously driven, out of town to see shows, but the first time I roadied with a band, was his band. And so we go way back.
okay. So, I wanted to ask you, you seem like you were really into the whole concept of live albums. Like James Brown was like
James Brown is my number one. I love live albums. I love Jonathan Richman, the Modern Lovers live record, the Precise Modern Lovers Order. And I love James Brown Live, the Apollo Part 2, particularly. And just live records, especially fake live records like the Seeds, whatever that, the Seeds live record is so great. And the 13th Floor Elevators live record, which is also fake. I love Sam Cooke live at the Harlem Club.
Were they always fake? Because like Kiss and Peter Frampton added like audience noise, and they changed the solos, and they weren't singing into the mic and stuff.
I think there was a lot of blending, like the MC5 live record, Kick Out the Jams, is kind of like, I think it's live but augmented. Like they went in and put some solos over it or something. I don't know for sure. But yeah, I just love them. I love the Doors live record.
Oh, right. Yeah,
I mean,
13, or that's not it.
Well, they have a couple. They have two, like I forget which one, but yeah,
I know what
there's.
you're talking about.
But anyway, yeah, I just love live records. And when growing up, when you get live record is always kind of like considered like the bad, it's like bad because you're used to this, the perfect, perfection, and then so the live record is something, it took me a little while to understand, but once you get into it, it's kind of like comedy, you have to get into the rhythm of it, and then you start really loving it. I love the idea that the Grateful Dead just stopped recording and just let the audience record.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we're kind of at that point now where that's, there's no reason to make a definitive recording anymore because everybody's recording all the time.
So like it seems like you have all these bands like Nation of Ulysses, Weird War, Scene Creamers, The Makeup, and then you'll do a band and then you'll stop the band, and then it seems like 5 years later there's some band in Sweden who look like The Makeup or Nation of Ulysses. We're kind of like got the same record collection,
Yeah.
and now we got this band, Fake Names, and there's a guy. Brendan Canty's actually in the band. I mean, what's we're gonna have Michelle May in the band? I mean, what do you think about all these Swedish bands who seem like they it's like I mean there was these guys. I mean, Iggy was definitely influenced by the Doors, and James Chance definitely had a James Brown influence there. But
Yeah.
what's up with you and the Swedish bands? It seems like they wait for you to do something, and they're probably going to start writing their books in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it. I don't know. I mean, I think Sweden, they call Sweden the Japan of Europe, and a big part of it is that they're really into mimicry, copying things. And it's the cultural idea, that like why is originality, what's good about originality? I don't know, like, should people be original? Like, more and more, I think it's kind of fading into the, it's in a sense, maybe the Swedes are kind of forward thinking because they abandoned originality early, you know what I mean? Like, and because now, now I think bands are admired for mimicking something more than an original voice. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What do you think of that? So I think it's just an aspect of, art now, is that, like, to do something like something is much more valued than when we were younger, where that was really like something that you wanted to obscure as much as possible. You wanted to really obscure your influences, and the idea of being called a copycat was really bad. Now Interpol, they're supposed to sound just like Joy Division. You know what I mean?
Well, my take would be like, Americans, I mean, we have like folk music and gospel and all the rock and roll. I mean, it's all in our DNA. And if you listen to Swedish folk music, it's way different. If they do anything like you have that First Aid Kit band, and they acting like they're from like the Midwest or something. Like they're a country. It's almost every band is like an art project in Sweden. It's like
Yeah, yeah,
it's a
exactly.
conceptual group because it's not rooted in anything real. It's like they went to art school and they were like Brian Ferry and grabbing all these things, and then this is the band.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you think about Chinese brush painting, like that's a good example of like mimicry as art. And the idea is that you're trying to do something precisely the same, so there's a whole idea of, art as recreation, or, a lot of choreography would be to try to like, you know, or, what I mean? Like, so the whole, it's just, we are Americans, so we have this idea of individualism, like, like you think hip hop is all about being original, so that's our hang up, is originality, but not everybody has that, you know.
Yeah, and oh, you had this great comment about punk rock and you know like the early punk rock and the hardcore scene. And you said it on a soft focus thing. The idea was, were these guys prophets, or did they just have negative thoughts that were so strong that they influence culture through their negative thoughts and putting out that negative energy? What, like, were they like Nostradamus, or were they propagandists?
Yeah, yeah.
With
Well,
the
I think
with the
that a lot.
negative thing. I went to this thing about 5 years ago where Jack from TSOL and Keith Morris from the Circle Jerks and one of the Go-Go's was there, and I asked them that I did a form of that question, and they were pretty befuddled. I think Jack made some comment, about hardcore or something, but they didn't really answer the question. What do you think? Do you think are
Well,
they?
I think that was a good question, and that it's now more than ever, what you would say is like, do the digital overlords study science fiction and try to mimic the dystopia that they read, that you read in classic science fiction, or were the science fiction writers prophetic? So in a
Yeah,
sense, before, my question was about punk. Oh, did punk create this world, this dystopian landscape? Well, because it was about politics and blah blah George Bush or something, and but now it would be like, do the cyber overlords, who are obviously science fiction nerds, I mean, they're nerds, they're science fiction nerds, so they have all read Orwell, and they've all read, Logan's Run. They've all read, you know, or seen Logan's Run. They've all seen Rollerball. They've all seen Zardoz. They've all seen the dystopian canon of science fiction. So when they create this kind of landscape, like the 1984 landscape, which is about this kind of linguistic engineering that is like turns the world upside down. That's very similar to what we're experiencing now. And then when you think about the screens on the wall that survey everybody and the interactive screens, in Fahrenheit 451, the games people play with the screen and everybody, I mean, the parallels are so uncanny. And then you realize that maybe the people who kind of run, Google or whatever, they're not that creative, so they do need source material for their kind of innovation. Essentially they have this technology. So then the question is, what are they going to do with the technology? They don't really have the imagination to do anything but mimic 1984. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So the whole Big Brother, this whole kind of control state, and the just all the stuff that we're dealing with, which is so it's weirdly, it's eerily reminiscent of things that we've read.
But Huxley was more, he thought that we're going to be so entertained that the true revolutionary spirit would be gone, like we through drugs, through like, visual stimulus, we would be so overwhelmed that would, like, because like Orwell was more about like, fascism or state control, and Huxley was more, no, it's going to be more, people are going to like, you know pleasure is the problem.
But there aren't, but both the prophecies have come true.
Yeah, yeah.
They're just interchangeable, I mean, it's like pleasure, fascism or something, do you know what I mean? Like, so you're right. I mean, the problem with 1984 is every kind of depiction of it is so unpleasant that you don't want to watch it. It's kind of like watching a documentary about the Khmer Rouge, it's just so unpleasant that it's not fun to watch. Whereas we like our science fiction to be like dystopian, but also pop. So Logan's Run is a dystopia that we are into because it's like, oh, well, it's fun, whereas like, 1984 is always like, ugh, it's like, ugh. But
Well,
anyway,
yeah.
but I think both things, could be true. I mean, both things are, yeah, anyway.
Well, I mean, you're a certain age, so there's like certain cultural critics that kind of like don't get really mentioned anymore. I mean, I remember in the '70s, this guy Colin Wilson was around, and you mentioned Marshall McLuhan, and I remember when I used to go into Goodwills in the '80s, Alvin Toffler's Future Shock used to be in every, like
Yeah.
the copies of it. I mean, where do you see yourself anywhere in that, what you're doing in that kind of same field with what they were doing like in the '60s and '70s?
Well, I think what's interesting now is that like that, oh, you mean like, oh, do you mean like in the Goodwill or like, or
Oh,
do you mean
no. I mean, like, well, I would see those books, and I would just see like they were like popular books, and like, yeah.
Yeah, well, I definitely like those kind of books, and I definitely am probably, mimicking those books or inspired by them. Definitely Marshall McLuhan. I mean, Marshall McLuhan, talk about an influence. Like, he was essentially a corporate consultant, so he's writing these books about communications and, media, but he's also, being hired by, IBM or whatever to tell them what the future is going to be. So if anybody informed, he's the one who coined the global village. He's the one who said that the digital world would be one where everybody reacted simultaneously to stimuli and that there would be no individuals anymore. And I mean, he really prophesized kind of the digital utopia that we're, this thing. And he was a Catholic, and he saw it as almost like a kind of, I think he saw it as a kind of like the culmination of, this, it's kind of the God, this spiritual concept, when people say, when somebody dies and people are like, oh, well, they're all around us or something, so in a way it was like this idea of mass consciousness and us being absorbed into mass consciousness and letting go of our physical body is something that I think Marshall McLuhan prophesized, but he also maybe saw it as a kind of like, you know, it's a religious, that this was, kind of going to be this, realization of this God, all one God thing, Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
But anyway, I think that that's definitely a big inspiration for, the kind of billionaires, the digital overlords. So what a big concern for them is overpopulation and resources. And they really are concerned with convincing people to kind of let go of, number one, the idea that you could own anything. And number two, even the idea that you should be harnessed to a body. So I think for the poor, we're being kind of corralled into this new, thing where we're supposed to like lose our, they're going to tell us that our bodies are these really unfortunate inheritances, and that they're really, just a nuisance, and that you should kind of, get on the cloud or whatever. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's kind of
So
the goal, I think, for the Silicon Valley people. Do you know what I mean?
so the most important, your main idea is embodiment. That's the most important thing. That's like, Jesus had a body. He just wasn't like some kind of Platonic idea. He had a human body at some point, or even if he took a form. He wasn't like some kind of idea. Even if it's still a story, part of the story is he had the flesh. Jesus was flesh.
Yeah. The word made flesh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you like the whole idea of having a body. That's
Well, it's just what I'm used to. And like, yeah, you're right. I like physical things. Like, I'm really hung up on objects. Like, I like objects because I like them as, like, in the way that an archaeologist likes an object. I think that when we're making these sweeping generalization, like, we grow up with all these myths and we accept them, and that's part of the narrative of the world that we live in, so then if you have all these myths and you repeat them, and oh, well, the Velvet Underground, nobody liked the Velvet Underground, blah, but whatever, these things, and that creates a framework for our, whatever our idea of what the world is. And the reason but I love physical objects because they often counter their they kind of counteract the myth that you've inherited, or they add to it, or, they just augment it, or they make it more interesting. I don't know. I like, objects. I like finding objects. And one of the most nefarious things about the modern age is this idea that, oh, we're supposed to put all the literature on Google. We're supposed to put all our records on Google. We're supposed to put everything, in this digital world. And we've already seen how that's really dangerous, because, history is constantly being revised, the history is constantly being revised, and our access to history is always being revised. I mean, look up a song on Spotify, and if it's not on Spotify, it kind of like doesn't exist. And, people's, I don't know, it's just this kind of history that can be invented, it's a really nefarious thing.
Well, let me ask you this: where is rock music today? To me, like rock and roll seemed kind of forbidden. It was definitely like there was like the black element involved. That's the source. That it was sort of unhealthy in a way. I mean, I think, or I don't know. Some people, when I first got into punk or even like early hip hop, I mean, some people were just kind of scratching their heads. They're go, oh shit, oh, okay, let's see, no, let's see, 10 minutes, okay, whatever. We got 10 minutes left. So, okay, so, well, let me just ask you about rock and roll.
Rock and roll. I mean, I think rock and roll is really still, I don't know, it's still just this technology that's so incredible. It's just still incredible because it's the one thing that, it's just really still the people's art form. It's like anybody, it has no definition. Anybody can make it. You don't have to have any talent. You just have to have an idea or just the audacity to do it, or the will. You have to have the will, not the audacity. And you can really say anything through it. And it's just an incredible technology. It's unlike any other art form, really. And it's still like, it's at this point like indie rock or whatever, the thing that has grown out of punk is probably the most innocuous, tepid, bland thing that has, I mean, it's way worse than yacht rock in the 70s. It's way more inoffensive. It's way more corporate. It's way more top 40 in a way. It's like, if you think about the festival circuit, it's more corporate than Van Halen. It's just like, it's you can't say anything interesting in the milieu of indie rock. You can't be anything interesting. It's completely just NPR, New York Times crap. But rock and roll is still just has endless possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of leads to my next question. It just seems like a lot of the stuff we were talking about was about like a healthy counterculture. It was like, hey, we're going to embrace this counterculture. It's opposed to that, and we're just
Yeah,
gonna. It's as good as that. People just don't know it yet.
yeah,
And yeah, in the '90s, like bands like Green Day are good, but they're not sponsored. Bands in the '60s and '70s weren't sponsored by Budweiser, or I went to that LA Freeze thing yesterday. It was sponsored by Deutsche Bank or whatever.
yeah.
Or it just seems things seem a little more corporate. Either you're part of the mainstream or you're like nothing. There's no healthy counterculture.
Yeah, exactly. There's no alternative, and people are really afraid to say anything different because they know that there's kind of, it's a zero-sum game almost. Like if you're not kissing ass to Deutsche Bank, you're kind of just you're not going to have any there's no, you're not going to exist. Whereas you're right, there used to be, well, Black Flag existed in an alternate universe that was actually, they could actually make money and do, and could do it, and they could really say anything they wanted, and it was completely, they were just operating in a different, dimension. And but more and more, I think that people are gonna, this situation now with this, like the conceit of indie rock, that it's kind of the inherent, that it's somehow attached to punk, is gonna be, it's just, the wheels are going to fall off this conceit that South by Southwest and these kind of, internet magazines, this kind of really corporate, really tabloid, tepid mainstream bullshit it doesn't represent any kind of counterculture, and that it's not, it's not the progeny of punk. It's like the opposite of punk. Or whatever, if punk is a counterculture, it's like it's really like, it just really it's just the worst thing ever for culture. I mean, art, and it's really attached to fashion and art, and fashion and art are just, money laundering. It's just like, it's country club, it's just country club stuff. It's like, it's this big country club, and everybody's afraid not to be invited, but at a certain point people are gonna, have to create something that is an alternative to that.
So we have let's say we have a few minutes. So the book's called Against the Written Word here. Let me talk about a few of the chapters. Chapter 1 was kind of more about the printed word versus rock and roll. Like some, music sometimes was written out on notes and people played it like, classical music. And there's other people that never bothered to read music and stuff. Do you think that's kind of related? What are you talking about there?
Well, Against the Written Word is the first anti-literacy book ever, and it's just talking about the project of universal literacy and why universal literacy is such a, it's so important to the ruling class. Why are they so concerned with the working people's ability to read when they don't really care about, healthcare, housing, or, anything, environmental degradation. They don't really care about junk food or people dying of heart disease. The ruling class is just about money. So why are they so concerned with us learning our ABCs? And it's like, well, it's obvious because it's so that we can read their propaganda. So it's really just the anti-literacy, it's just kind of it's basically it's a call to arms for people to embrace illiteracy. And it's really proposing rock and roll as a kind of antidote to literacy, and when rock and roll started, it was seen as a great threat by the ruling class, something that spread illiteracy, that created illiteracy in its listeners, something they called juvenile delinquency. And so it's basically, it's a very compelling argument. I think everybody should read this book, Against the Written Word. It's really the first anti-literacy book. It's a historic book. It's really a compelling argument, and I think it's just really I don't know. I mean, didn't you feel convinced by chapter one?
Oh yeah, sure, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it's definitely going to be. I mean, this book definitely stands out. Like, because I read a lot of books still. I read 100 books last year, and this book definitely stands out. Like, its uniqueness, and it's like I read Jared Kobeck's "I Hate the Internet" a few years ago, and it kind of like how it's a similar place for that book.
oh, cool. Yeah, somebody just gave me Jarrett Kobeck's Only Americans Burn in Hell.
Yeah, well, and there you had a chapter about tourism. Like when the last time I was in London, I went to the William Blake exhibit, and William Blake's somebody that lived maybe 200 years ago, and he only stayed in that Soho part of London,
His
and
whole life.
and just maybe like 8 blocks his whole life. So like, yeah, tourism is another thing about the rich. Like they want everywhere is like like a resort.
Yeah. Well, this idea of, like, I mean, neoliberalism creating identical conditions everywhere. That's imperialism. This kind of mandate that Airbnb and tourism create, and the soft power, or whatever it's called, soft power, or like, the site that, tourism. So it basically neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? It's the idea that, like, you can get the workers to pay for themselves. You don't really, a big aspect, like the universities, when the universities went neoliberal, it's when all the tenured professors were retired and they got these adjunct professors in who you didn't really have to pay. And the idea is like, oh, well, this is a great opportunity, and blah blah blah. And so in a sense, the book is proposing the idea that the tourist is really the neoliberal soldier, a soldier that pays their own, they pay their own room and board, they pay for their own transport, because an invading army is actually like an expense that the libertarian, the new libertarian elite hate government. They hate the expense of government. They don't want to pay for the kind of, things that government has to pay for, like the police, or pensions or whatever. So the libertarian ideology is like, get rid of government, and capitalism runs itself. So in a sense, the tourist is